Fall 1999, Menlo Park, California. The dot-com bubble inflated like a hot air balloon in a windstorm. Every venture capitalist in Silicon Valley threw money at anything with a dot-com attached to its name. Business plans were scribbled on napkins. Revenue was optional. The game was about eyeballs, not earnings. Get big fast, figure out profits later. Into the modest offices of Kleiner, Perkins, Caulfield and Bias walked two Stanford graduate school dropouts. Larry Page, 26 years old, wore cargo pants and sneakers. Sergey Brin, also 26, had barely combed his hair. They carried a PowerPoint deck with 17 slides. Only 2 slides contained numbers. They had added 3 cartoons just to flesh it out. They were pitching Google, the 18th search engine, to enter an already crowded market. AltaVista existed. Yahoo dominated. Lycos, Excite, InfoGeek, the landscape was littered with search engines, each claiming to be the best. Most investors thought search was a solved problem, a commodity feature, not a standalone business. The real money, everyone knew, was in portals, sites that aggregated content and advertising, like Yahoo. Page and Brin had no business model. They had not figured out how to make a single dollar. They had made one small deal with the Washington Post to provide search results, but that was it. No revenue. No management team. No clear path to profitability. Just an algorithm they claimed was better than everything else, something they called PageRank, which ranked websites based on how many other sites linked to them. Sitting across from them was John Doerr, 48 years old, wearing his trademark khakis and button-down shirt. He was already one of Silicon Valley's most successful venture capitalists. Over the previous 19 years at Kleiner Perkins, he had backed Compaq, which grew into one of the world's largest PC manufacturers. He invested in Sun Microsystems when it was just for Stanford students with a workstation idea. He bet on Intuit when Quicken was just accounting software. He championed Netscape, which ignited the commercial internet. He spotted Amazon when it was just books. Doerr had developed what he called a Missionary versus Mercenary framework for evaluating founders. Mercenaries were in it for the money. They were smart, capable, often successful, but they would pivot to wherever the dollars flowed. Missionaries were different. They were possessed by an idea. They believed they were going to change the world. They would work 20-hour days not because they wanted to get rich, though they might, but because they could not imagine not doing this work. Steve Jobs was a missionary. So was Jeff Bezos. As Larry and Sergey presented, Doerr watched them carefully. He was not just listening to the pitch. He was reading their body language, their conviction, their relationship with each other. Sergey explained the technology with the enthusiasm of a child showing off a science project. Larry talked about the mission as if it were inevitable: organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Most VCs would be asking about the business model. How will you monetize? What's the revenue forecast? When will you be profitable? Doerr asked different questions. He wanted to understand their vision. How big could this be? What's stopping you? What do you need to succeed? He was pattern matching against decades of experience. Did they have the obsessive intensity of Jobs? The relentless execution capability of Andy Grove? The missionary zeal that could not be faked? The meeting was ending when Doerr posed one final question, almost casually: how big do you think this can be? There was a pause. Then Larry Page looked him straight in the eye and said, without hesitation, $10 billion. Doerr blinked. He had been thinking maybe $1 billion, perhaps $2 billion if everything went perfectly. $10 billion would make Google larger than Yahoo, which was currently worth about $40 to $60 billion and was the dominant player. Was Page talking about market capitalization? You mean market cap, right? Doerr asked. No, Page said flatly. Revenue. The room went quiet. $10 billion in revenue, by the standard valuation multiples of the time, implied a market capitalization of roughly $100 billion. In 1999, only a handful of companies in the entire world were worth that much. Microsoft, General Electric, ExxonMobil, a few others. Yahoo, Google's main competitor, had never come close to those heights. But Larry Page was not guessing. He was not hoping. He was stating what he saw as fact. Google would be that big because the opportunity was that big. The world's information needed organizing. Every person, every business, every government would need this service. It was not a nice to have. It was infrastructure for the information age. Most venture capitalists would have smiled politely and shown them the door. The business plan had no revenue model. The market looked saturated. The founders had never managed anything bigger than a research project. They were asking for $12.5 million on the basis of an algorithm and a dream. But John Doerr was not most venture capitalists. He recognized what he was seeing because he had seen it before. At Intel, he watched Andy Grove transform a memory chip company into a microprocessor empire through sheer force of will and disciplined execution. At Sun Microsystems, he observed Scott McNealy and Bill Joy build a workstation company that would define enterprise computing. At Netscape, he witnessed Mark Andreessen and Jim Clark bet that the internet would change everything when most people did not know what a browser was. This feeling, this combination of audacious vision, technical brilliance, and absolute conviction, was what he had spent 2 decades learning to recognize. It was the signature of Missionary founders. They were not trying to build a nice business. They were trying to change the world, and they would either succeed spectacularly or fail completely. There was no middle ground. What Doerr saw in Larry and Sergey was something even rarer than missionary zeal. They were right. The internet was exploding. Information was multiplying exponentially. Search was not solved, it was broken. The existing engines returned terrible results, overwhelmed by spam and manipulation. Page and Brin had actually invented something fundamentally better. Their algorithm worked. That was not faith. That was fact. 2 weeks later, Doerr wrote one of the biggest checks of his career, an $11.8 million investment for 12% of Google. He joined the board. And in that same period, shortly after the investment closed, he brought them a gift more valuable than the capital. Doerr arrived at Google's modest offices, a 2-story L-shaped building off Highway 101 in Mountain View, carrying manila folders and a whiteboard marker. The entire company, maybe 35 people, gathered in their cramped conference room. Larry and Sergey sat at the front. Engineers squeezed into corners. Marissa Meyer, employee number 20, leaned against a wall. Susan Wojcicki, who rented them her garage when they were getting started, sat cross-legged on the floor. "I want to teach you something," Doerr began, "that I learned from the best manager I've ever seen. It's called OKRs, Objectives and Key Results. It's how Intel went from being a failing memory chip company to dominating microprocessors. It's how Sun Microsystems coordinated hundreds of engineers to ship workstations on impossible deadlines. It's how you're going to take this company from 35 people to 10,000 without losing your way." The room was skeptical. These were engineers. They like building things, not management frameworks. But they humored him because he just gave them $12 million and seemed to actually understand what they were trying to do. Doerr drew on the whiteboard. An objective is what you want to achieve. It should be significant, concrete, action-oriented, and inspirational. A key result is how you know you're making progress. It must be measurable and verifiable. At the end of a quarter, you should be able to look at your key results and, without any arguments, know whether you achieved them. Yes or no. Simple. He told them about Andy Grove, the Hungarian immigrant who survived the Holocaust, came to America with nothing, and became the greatest manager in technology history. Grove taught Doerr OKRs in 1975 during a course at Intel. At the time, Intel was getting crushed by Japanese memory chip makers who were dumping chips below cost. The company was dying. Grove gathered the executive team and created a single objective: establish the 8086 as the highest performance 16-bit microprocessor family. That objective became Operation Crush, a campaign that aligned every person at Intel around one goal. Within months, Intel had recaptured 85% of the 16-bit market. Without OKRs, Doerr emphasized, there would be no Intel. There would be no personal computer revolution. Here's why this matters for you, Doerr continued. You're going to grow faster than any company in history. You're going to hire thousands of people. Engineers from Stanford. Business people from McKinsey. Sales teams from Oracle. Every one of them will have their own ideas about what Google should do. Without OKRs, you'll have chaos. Brilliant chaos, but chaos. With OKRs, everyone will know exactly what matters most, right now, this quarter. You'll say no to 1,000 good ideas to focus on the 10 great ones. That's how you get to $10 billion. Larry Page listened intently. His mind worked in systems and frameworks. He was already thinking about how to apply this. Sergey Brin asked challenging questions, probing for weaknesses in the concept. This was how they always worked, Larry the architect, Sergey the critic, together forming a complete decision-making unit. Over the next 20 years, OKRs would become Google's operating system. When the company debated whether to build Chrome, the browser that would eventually dethrone Internet Explorer, they used OKRs to define success metrics. When they launched Android and decided to make it free to compete with Apple's iPhone, they measured progress through key results. When they reorganized into Alphabet to separate core search from moonshot projects, they used OKRs to ensure each unit knew its mission. But in that cramped conference room in 1999, none of that was visible. What Doerr understood, what made him different from every other investor chasing dot-com deals, was that capital was cheap and getting cheaper. By late 1999, anyone with a pulse and a PowerPoint could raise millions. The real constraint was not money. It was execution. It was the ability to translate a vision into an organization, into products, into revenue. That was what OKRs enabled. This scene, investing $12 million in 2 graduate students with no business model while everyone else chased proven revenue models, then immediately teaching them a goal-setting system most people had never heard of, captured everything that made John Doerr the most successful venture capitalist of the Internet era. First, he had a framework for identifying missionary founders. While others looked at business plans and financial projections, Doerr looked at conviction and technical capability. Could these founders see something others could not? Were they building something 10 times better than alternatives? Did they have the intensity to work 100-hour weeks for a decade? That pattern recognition came from watching Andy Grove, Steve Jobs, Scott McNealy, Jeff Bezos, and dozens of others. He knew what world-changing founders looked like because he had been in the room with them. Second, he understood that the biggest opportunities hide in plain sight. Search engines existed. Everyone knew about them. The consensus was that the market was saturated, that Yahoo had won. But Doerr recognized that consensus is often a contrarian indicator. When everyone believes something is solved, that is exactly when breakthrough innovations happen. The personal computer market was solved by IBM until Apple and Compaq redefined it. Online commerce was impossible until Amazon proved otherwise. Doerr had seen this pattern enough times to trust his judgment over crowd wisdom. Third, and most importantly, he did not just write checks. He was operationally valuable. The OKR system was not a gimmick. It was a proven methodology that had helped Intel survive an existential crisis, that had scaled Sun Microsystems, that had kept Netscape focused during explosive growth. Doerr could credibly say, "I've seen this movie before. Here's how it goes. Here's how you avoid the mistakes that killed other fast-growing companies." That made founders want to work with him even when other VCs offered similar terms. This combination, pattern recognition for breakthrough founders, willingness to bet against consensus, and operational value add beyond capital, separated Doerr from the herd. In 1999, hundreds of VCs funded thousands of internet companies. Most failed. The few that succeeded had something in common: they were missionary companies, led by obsessed founders, backed by investors who understood how to scale the impossible. Google would eventually generate not $10 billion but over $300 billion in annual revenue. Its market capitalization would peak above $2 trillion, 20 times Larry Page's audacious 1999 prediction. That investment of $11.8 million would return over $5 billion to Kleiner Perkins, making it one of the most profitable venture capital investments in history. But Doerr's genius was not getting lucky once. It was doing this repeatedly. Before Google, there was Amazon. Before Amazon, there was Netscape. Before Netscape, there were Sun Microsystems, Compaq, Intuit. After Google, there would be Twitter and other companies. The pattern persisted across 3 decades and 3 technological revolutions: personal computing, the internet, and mobile social cloud. What made this possible? How does someone consistently spot the companies that will define entire eras? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. To St. Louis, Missouri, in 1951. To a middle-class family with 5 children. To a boy who would spend 6 years at Intel watching Andy Grove transform management science. To the moment in 1980 when Grove told him that venture capital isn't a real job and Doerr decided to prove him spectacularly wrong. When John Doerr was born on June 29, 1951, in St. Louis, Missouri, America stood at the midpoint of the 20th century, transformed by war and teetering on the edge of revolutionary change. The world he entered was one of triumphant post-war prosperity shadowed by Cold War anxiety, where the American dream seemed achievable for white middle-class families while profound inequities simmered beneath the surface. The year 1951 marked a pivotal moment in American history. The Korean War was in its 2nd year, sending young American men to fight communism on the other side of the world. President Harry Truman had just relieved General Douglas MacArthur of command, a controversial decision that dominated headlines and illustrated the tensions between military ambition and civilian control. The specter of nuclear war hung over everything. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools, as if hiding under desks would protect them from atomic bombs. Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade was reaching its fever pitch, destroying careers and lives with accusations of disloyalty. Yet despite these anxieties, America was booming. The economy was growing at over 8% annually. Unemployment sat below 4%. Wages were rising. The GI Bill was sending millions of veterans to college, creating the most educated workforce in human history. Suburban housing developments were sprawling across farmland as families fled cities for quarter-acre lots with white picket fences. The American middle class, which had barely existed before the war, was expanding rapidly. Television was transforming American culture. In 1951, the first coast-to-coast television broadcast occurred, connecting the nation in real time. I Love Lucy premiered that year, becoming an instant phenomenon. Families gathered around small black and white screens to watch the same shows, creating shared cultural experiences that unified the country in ways previously impossible. The mass media age had arrived. Technology was advancing with breathtaking speed. The first credit card, Diners Club, had been introduced the year before, beginning the transformation from cash to credit that would reshape consumer behavior. The first computer designed for business use, UNIVAC I, was delivered to the Census Bureau in 1951, though few people understood its significance. Computing was still the domain of massive room-sized machines tended by specialists. The idea of a personal computer was science fiction. In St. Louis, where John Doerr was born, the city was experiencing both growth and the first signs of urban decay that would devastate many American cities over the coming decades. The population had peaked at 856,000 in 1950 and would begin a long decline as white families fled to suburbs. The city was still racially segregated. The brewing industry, which had made St. Louis famous, was consolidating. Anheuser-Busch was growing into a national powerhouse while smaller breweries closed. St. Louis was a manufacturing hub, a city built on making things. Aircraft, automobiles, shoes, beer, the economy ran on factories and warehouses. This was the tail end of industrial America's golden age, before automation and globalization would hollow out the manufacturing base. A man could get a job at a factory, work there for 40 years, and retire with a pension. That was the promise of the American industrial economy, and for a brief period, it delivered. The Doerr family was firmly middle class. John's father, Doerr, worked in manufacturing, part of that industrial economy. The family was not wealthy, but they were not struggling. They had enough. That middle-class stability, the sense that hard work and education would lead to upward mobility, shaped John's worldview in profound ways. He grew up with enough security to take risks, but not so much privilege that he felt entitled to success. John Doerr was one of 5 siblings in a family where education and hard work were deeply valued. His father, Doerr, worked in manufacturing and was an entrepreneurial figure who inspired John's future career. Lou embodied the promise of industrial America: show up, work hard, earn a living, support your family. But beyond his occupation, Lou appears to have been entrepreneurial in spirit, if not always in practice. There was an inventiveness to his thinking, a curiosity about how things worked and how they could work better. This was not the kind of father who told his son to play it safe. This was a father who encouraged thinking differently. John's mother remains less documented in public sources, but her role in a family of 5 children in 1950s America would have been intensive and essential. In that era, raising 5 children while managing a household was a full-time occupation requiring remarkable organizational skills, patience, and strategic thinking. The domestic sphere was where many women's talents were channeled, and the best household managers were essentially chief operating officers running complex operations with no staff and limited resources. Growing up in a large family taught John essential lessons that would serve him throughout his career. He learned to compete for attention and resources. He learned to negotiate and collaborate. He learned that you do not always get your way, and that sometimes supporting someone else's success creates opportunities for your own advancement. Large families are training grounds for the kind of coalition building and consensus seeking that define successful venture capital partnerships. The Doerr household was Catholic, placing John in a religious and educational tradition that emphasized discipline, structured thinking, and moral responsibility. He attended Chaminade College Preparatory School, a Catholic high school in St. Louis run by the Marianist order. Chaminade was academically rigorous, college preparatory education that pushed students to excel while instilling values of service and leadership. At Chaminade, John discovered his aptitude for science and mathematics. These were not just school subjects to him. They were languages that explained how the world worked. While other students struggled with calculus or physics, John found them intuitive and elegant. The clarity of mathematics, that every problem has a solution if you apply the right tools and think clearly, appealed to his methodical mind. But John was not a narrow tech geek, even early on. He was curious about everything. How did businesses work? Why did some succeed while others failed? What motivated people? How did you lead a team? These were not questions his engineering classes addressed, but they fascinated him. Even in high school, he was thinking about the intersection of technology and human systems, though he did not yet have a framework for understanding it. The values John absorbed from his family and his education created the foundation for his later philosophy. From his father, he learned to think entrepreneurially, to see possibilities where others saw constraints. From his mother, managing a large family with limited resources, he learned operational excellence, how to coordinate complex moving parts toward a common goal. From his Catholic education, he learned discipline, structured thinking, and a sense of moral obligation to use his talents for something larger than personal enrichment. This last point is crucial. John Doerr would become extraordinarily wealthy, a billionaire many times over, but money was never his primary motivation. He was driven by something else, the desire to back entrepreneurs who were trying to change the world. He wanted to be part of building things that mattered, companies that would improve people's lives, technologies that would advance human capability. This missionary impulse, this sense that business could be a force for good, traces directly back to his Catholic education and family values. Of course, growing up in St. Louis in the 1950s and 1960s also meant growing up in a racially segregated society that was beginning to confront its inequities. The civil rights movement was challenging the status quo. John would have been 13 in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act passed, 15 in 1966 when the Black Power movement emerged, 17 in 1968 when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. These events shaped his generation's consciousness, creating awareness that systems needed changing and that change required courage. After graduating from Chaminade in the late 1960s, John Doerr headed to Rice University in Houston, Texas, to study electrical engineering. This was a significant decision. Rice was and remains one of America's top engineering schools, selective and rigorous. It was not the obvious choice for a kid from St. Louis. MIT, Stanford, or Berkeley would have been more typical destinations for top engineering students. But Rice offered something distinctive, a strong engineering program combined with a liberal arts foundation, emphasizing not just technical skill but humanistic thinking. At Rice, John pursued both bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering, completing both by 1975. These were transformative years, not just academically but historically. John entered Rice around 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War protests and social upheaval. The campus was alive with debates about technology's role in society. Engineers were being recruited to build weapons systems. The Pentagon funded much university research. Students were questioning whether their technical skills should serve the military-industrial complex or could be applied to civilian innovations that improved lives. This context shaped John's thinking. He was learning to design circuits and build systems, but he was also wrestling with larger questions. What should technology be used for? Who benefits from innovation? How do you ensure technical progress serves human needs? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They were urgent ethical dilemmas facing his generation. The electrical engineering program at Rice was intense. Students learned everything from fundamental physics and mathematics through circuit design, signal processing, and computer architecture. But the program also emphasized systems thinking, how components fit together into larger wholes, how to optimize complex systems with many interacting parts, how to debug when something goes wrong. This systems-level perspective would prove invaluable in venture capital, where the challenge is understanding not just individual technologies but entire business ecosystems. John excelled academically. He was not just passing courses. He was at the top of his class, demonstrating the kind of technical mastery that would later give him credibility with the entrepreneur engineers he would fund. When John Doerr evaluated a technical pitch years later, he could understand the technology at a deep level. He could ask the right questions. Engineers knew they could not snow him with buzzwords or hand-waving. But John's education was not limited to engineering. He took courses in economics, history, and literature. He was becoming what we would now call a T-shaped person, deep expertise in one domain, engineering, combined with broad knowledge across many fields. This combination is rare and powerful. Most engineers stay narrow. Most business people lack technical depth. John was building both. After completing his master's degree in electrical engineering in 1975, John made another pivotal decision: he would pursue an MBA. But not just any MBA, he applied to Harvard Business School, the most prestigious business program in the world. This was unusual. Most engineers who wanted business skills might get a Stanford MBA, staying on the West Coast where tech was booming. Harvard was East Coast, traditional, finance-oriented. It was where future investment bankers and management consultants went, not future technology executives. John got in, enrolling in fall 1975. Harvard Business School's pedagogy was distinctive, the case method. Every class, students analyzed a real business situation, debating what the executives should do. There were no lectures, no textbooks in the traditional sense. Just cases, hundreds of them, covering every industry, every geography, every type of business challenge. Students learned by arguing about decisions, defending their reasoning, attacking others' assumptions. This was perfect training for venture capital. A VC's job is evaluating companies across wildly different industries and business models, making decisions with incomplete information under time pressure. The case method teaches exactly that: how to quickly digest a situation, identify the key issues, make a judgment, and articulate your reasoning. John was developing the decision-making framework he would use for the next 50 years. At Harvard, John also encountered something he had had less exposure to at Rice: pure ambition. Harvard Business School attracted the most aggressive, competitive, success-hungry students in the world. Everyone wanted to run something, a company, a division, an empire. The joke was that HBS grads spent their first 10 years after graduation trying to become CEO of something, anything. This was a culture of achievement and external validation. But John, shaped by his Midwestern middle-class upbringing and Catholic education, retained a different orientation. Yes, he wanted to succeed. Yes, he was competitive. But he was not driven purely by status or wealth. He wanted to build things that mattered. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself. This missionary impulse set him apart from many of his MBA classmates, who saw business primarily as a vehicle for personal enrichment. It was also at Harvard that John would have first seriously encountered the concept of venture capital. The 1970s saw the early formation of the modern VC industry. Legendary firms like Kleiner Perkins, founded 1972, and Sequoia, founded 1972, were just getting started on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park, California. The HBS faculty was studying this emerging field, trying to understand how these partnership structures worked and why Silicon Valley seemed to generate so many successful startups. John paid attention. Here was a model that combined his interests perfectly: technology, entrepreneurship, strategy, and the potential to build world-changing companies. Venture capital was not yet the established career path it would become. It was still new, somewhat mysterious, definitely risky. But to John, it sounded fascinating. He graduated from Harvard in 1976 with his MBA, armed with a powerful combination of skills, deep technical knowledge from his electrical engineering degrees, strategic thinking from his MBA, and a value system that oriented him toward missionary rather than mercenary motivations. He was 25 years old. The question was what to do next. In 1974, while still completing his MBA, John Doerr joined Intel Corporation, the pioneering semiconductor company in Santa Clara, California. The timing was extraordinary. Intel was developing the 8080, an 8-bit microprocessor that would become one of the most important chips in computing history. The 8080 was the chip that powered the Altair 8800, the first commercially successful personal computer. It was the chip that Bill Gates and Paul Allen would program in 1975, creating Microsoft Basic and launching the software revolution. John Doerr arrived at Intel just as the company was inventing the future. Intel in 1974 was already successful but facing enormous challenges. Founded in 1968 by Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, two of the legendary traitorous eight who had left Shockley Semiconductor to found Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel had pioneered memory chips, first SRAM, then DRAM. By the early 1970s, Intel dominated the memory market. But Japanese manufacturers were entering the game with cheaper, higher quality chips, and Intel's core business was under threat. The company was also in the midst of a leadership transition. Robert Noyce, the co-inventor of the integrated circuit and one of the most beloved figures in Silicon Valley, was the public face of Intel but was gradually ceding operational control to Andy Grove, the company's third employee and a management genius. Grove, a Hungarian immigrant who had survived the Holocaust by taking on a false identity, had arrived in America in 1956 with nothing. He learned English, put himself through City College of New York, earned a PhD in chemical engineering from Berkeley, and joined Intel when it was just a startup in 1968. By the time John Doerr arrived in 1974, Andy Grove was already transforming Intel through sheer force of will and a management philosophy that emphasized discipline, measurement, and operational excellence. Grove believed that companies succeed or fail based on execution, not just ideas. He pioneered concepts like OKRs, objectives and key results, which Intel used to align hundreds of employees around common goals. He created performance review systems that were rigorous and sometimes brutal. He demanded accountability at every level. John Doerr was assigned to various roles at Intel: engineering, marketing, management, and eventually sales. But his most important role was as a student of Andy Grove. In 1975, Doerr attended a course taught by Grove within Intel, where Grove explained his management philosophy. This is when Doerr first encountered OKRs, though he did not immediately grasp their full power. Grove explained his thinking: the key result has to be measurable. But at the end you can look, and without any arguments, did I do that or did I not do it? Yes? No? Simple. No judgments in it. This clarity, this refusal to tolerate ambiguity or excuse-making, was Grove's hallmark. He believed that most management failures stemmed from unclear objectives and unmeasurable results. If you did not know exactly what you were trying to achieve and how to measure success, you were doomed to wander. Doerr absorbed this lesson viscerally. He saw OKRs in action during one of Intel's most critical moments, Operation Crush. In late 1979, Intel was getting beaten badly by Motorola's 68,000 microprocessor, which was faster and easier to program than Intel's 8086. A district sales manager sent a desperate 8-page telex to headquarters warning that Intel was losing the 16-bit microprocessor war. Andy Grove responded by creating a single, crystal-clear objective: establish the 8086 as the highest-performance 16-bit microprocessor family. That objective became a corporate crusade. Every department, every team, every employee knew exactly what mattered most. Within weeks, Grove had assembled a task force, created a battle plan, and deployed crush teams to field offices worldwide. The entire workforce shifted its focus. Marketing created campaigns. Engineering prioritized performance improvements. Sales teams made heroic efforts to win design wins with key customers. The crown jewel, securing Intel's microprocessor inside the IBM personal computer, which would set the standard for the entire industry. By 1986, Intel had recaptured 85% of the 16-bit market. The 8086 and its cheaper variant, the 8088, became the foundation for the PC revolution. Without Operation Crush, there might not have been an Intel microprocessor monopoly. Without that monopoly, the history of personal computing would have been entirely different. John Doerr witnessed this transformation firsthand. He saw how a well-defined objective and measurable key results could align an entire organization, turning abstract strategy into concrete action. He saw how Grove's management discipline created competitive advantage. Most companies had smart people and good technology. Intel had something else, an operational system that turned potential into results. Doerr also became one of Intel's top salespeople, which taught him crucial lessons about customers, markets, and human nature. Sales is not about features and specifications. It is about understanding what the customer needs, what problems they are trying to solve, and how your product fits into their world. Doerr learned to listen more than he talked. He learned to ask questions that revealed hidden needs. He learned that the best sales conversations are collaborative problem-solving sessions, not pitches. This sales experience gave Doerr a crucial skill for venture capital, the ability to quickly assess whether an entrepreneur truly understood their customer. Many VCs come from finance or pure engineering backgrounds. Doerr came from sales, which meant he instinctively asked, "Who's the customer? What problem are you solving for them? Why will they buy this instead of alternatives? Have you actually talked to customers, or are you guessing?" But perhaps the most important thing Doerr learned at Intel was the concept of missionary versus mercenary. Andy Grove did not articulate it in exactly those terms, but he lived it. Grove was not at Intel for the salary or the stock options, though he became wealthy. He was there because he believed microprocessors would change the world, and he was determined to make Intel the company that changed it. That sense of mission, that conviction that the work mattered beyond quarterly earnings, permeated the company culture. Doerr saw how missionary companies operated differently than mercenary ones. At a missionary company, people worked weekends not because they were forced but because they could not stand not to. They debated product decisions with passion because they cared about getting it right. They took setbacks personally and celebrated victories collectively. The mission was bigger than any individual, which paradoxically made individuals willing to sacrifice for it. This distinction would become Doerr's primary framework for evaluating entrepreneurs decades later. When he met Larry and Sergey, when he invested in Jeff Bezos, when he backed Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen at Netscape, he was looking for missionary founders. People who were possessed by an idea, who believed they were going to change the world, who would sacrifice everything to make their vision real. By 1980, after 6 years at Intel, John Doerr had become one of the company's most promising young executives. He was 29 years old. He understood technology deeply from his engineering background. He understood business from his MBA and his sales experience. He understood operational excellence from watching Andy Grove. His career trajectory pointed towards senior management, perhaps eventually running a division or even becoming CEO of some technology company. Then he told Andy Grove he was leaving to become a venture capitalist. Grove's reaction was swift and dismissive. "That's not a real job." Grove's contempt was not personal. It reflected his worldview. Grove believed in building things, making things, shipping products. Venture capitalists, in his view, just pushed money around. They did not create anything. They were parasites, or at best middlemen, facilitating the real work done by engineers and managers. Why would someone with Doerr's talent waste it on venture capital when he could be running operations at a real company? But Doerr saw something Grove did not. He saw that venture capital, done right, could multiply impact. At Intel, even if he eventually became CEO, he could only build one company at a time. As a venture capitalist, he could help build dozens of companies. He could identify the best entrepreneurs before anyone else saw their potential. He could provide not just capital but guidance, connecting founders with the operational knowledge he had gained at Intel. He could take what he had learned from Grove and give it to the next generation of company builders. Grove thought venture capital was not a real job. Doerr would spend the next 40 years proving him spectacularly wrong. What made John Doerr consistently pick the companies that would define entire technological eras? The surface answer is that he invested in Google, Amazon, Netscape, and a dozen other legendary companies. But that describes outcomes, not capability. The deeper question is, how did he know? What did he see that others missed? The answer lies in a framework Doerr developed over decades of pattern matching against exceptional founders. While other venture capitalists looked at addressable markets and financial projections, Doerr looked at the founders themselves, searching for a specific type of personality and conviction. He called them missionaries versus mercenaries, and the distinction was not about business strategy or market opportunity. It was about fundamental motivation. Mercenary entrepreneurs, in Doerr's framework, are smart, capable people building companies primarily to make money. They have identified a market opportunity, calculated the potential returns, and are executing a business plan. They are rational actors optimizing for wealth. If the market shifts or a better opportunity emerges, they will pivot. If the company struggles, they might sell or shut down and move to the next thing. There is nothing wrong with this approach. Many successful companies are built by mercenaries. But they rarely create the kind of world-changing innovations that generate 100 times returns. Missionary entrepreneurs are different. They are possessed by an idea. They believe, with almost religious fervor, that they're going to change the world. They have seen a future that does not yet exist, and they cannot rest until they have made it real. They will work 100-hour weeks not because someone is forcing them, but because they cannot imagine doing anything else. They will persevere through failures that would cause mercenaries to quit. They will make decisions that sacrifice short-term profits for long-term vision. And most importantly, they will attract other missionaries to join them, creating a culture of true believers who share the mission. Doerr learned to identify missionary founders through specific signals. First, he listened to how they talked about their product or service. Mercenaries talked about market size, competitive positioning, revenue projections. Missionaries talked about the problem they were solving, the people they were helping, the future they were creating. When Jeff Bezos pitched Amazon, he did not lead with the online retail market is huge. He talked about how the internet would let him offer customers selection that was physically impossible in brick-and-mortar stores, how he could build the world's most customer-centric company. When Larry and Sergey pitched Google, they talked about organizing the world's information, not capturing search advertising revenue. Second, Doerr looked for technical excellence that was an order of magnitude better than alternatives. Missionary founders were not just building something slightly better. They were creating something fundamentally different, often based on a technical breakthrough or novel insight. PageRank was not incrementally better than existing search algorithms. It was categorically different, using the link structure of the web itself as data. Netscape's browser was not just faster than Mosaic. It was more intuitive, more powerful, capable of displaying rich media. Amazon was not just another bookstore. It was building distribution infrastructure and recommendation algorithms that would redefine retail. This focus on 10 times better technology came directly from Doerr's Intel experience. Andy Grove taught that in technology markets, marginal improvements rarely matter. You need breakthrough products that make alternatives obsolete. The 8086 did not succeed by being 10% faster than competitors. It succeeded by being the right architecture at the right time, creating a platform that others would build on for decades. Third, Doerr assessed the founders' relationship with reality. Missionary founders were optimistic, they had to be, or they would never attempt impossible things, but they were not delusional. They could articulate specific risks and how they would mitigate them. They could explain what might go wrong and what they would do about it. This combination of ambitious vision and rigorous thinking was rare. Many entrepreneurs had one or the other. Missionaries had both. Fourth, Doerr looked at the founding team's dynamics. The best companies were not built by solo geniuses but by complementary partnerships. Larry Page and Sergey Brin balanced each other, Larry the architect, Sergey the critic. Jeff Bezos surrounded himself with talented operators who could execute his vision. Mark Andreessen had Jim Clark bringing business experience and credibility. Missionary companies had founders who made each other better, who challenged each other's thinking, who covered each other's weaknesses. Finally, Doerr tried to understand what the founder would do if they had infinite resources. Mercenaries would take profits and diversify. Missionaries would reinvest everything into achieving their vision. This was not a hypothetical question. It revealed whether the entrepreneur saw the company as a vehicle for personal wealth or as a mission that transcended any individual. The missionary versus mercenary framework was not foolproof. Doerr backed some companies led by apparent missionaries that failed. He passed on some companies led by apparent mercenaries that succeeded. But the framework worked far more often than it failed, because missionary founders possessed something that could not be easily replicated: the ability to persevere through the valley of death that kills most startups. Every ambitious company faces moments where continuation seems impossible. The product is not working. Customers are not buying. Competitors are copying. Capital is running out. Employees are leaving. At those moments, mercenary founders do a rational cost-benefit analysis and often decide to cut their losses. Missionary founders dig deeper. They work harder. They find creative solutions. They inspire their teams to keep going. They survive when survival seems impossible. This pattern recognition framework gave Doerr an enormous advantage. While other VCs were analyzing spreadsheets and market research reports, Doerr was reading founder souls. While others asked about revenue projections, Doerr asked about mission and conviction. While others invested in good businesses, Doerr invested in great founders who would build transformative companies. John Doerr's 6 years at Intel gave him something most venture capitalists lack: deep operational knowledge of how great companies actually work. Most VCs come from consulting or finance backgrounds. They are smart about strategy and capital allocation, but they have never shipped a product, never managed a manufacturing line, never closed a major customer deal. They can evaluate business models but not operational reality. Doerr was different. He had been inside one of the best-run companies in the world during a period of existential challenge and successful transformation. He had seen Andy Grove take a company that was losing its core market and reorient it around a new opportunity. He had witnessed Operation Crush, where clear objectives and measurable key results aligned hundreds of people to win a market that seemed lost. He had participated in the brutal but effective performance management systems that Intel used to ensure accountability. This operational knowledge manifested in 3 specific advantages when Doerr became a venture capitalist. First, he could spot operational dysfunction early. When he joined a board or advised a portfolio company, he could quickly assess whether the organization had the disciplines necessary to scale. Did they have clear objectives? Were results measured and reviewed systematically? Did everyone know what the top priorities were? Were there mechanisms for rapid decision-making? These might sound like basic questions, but most startups lack these disciplines. They are run by founders who are brilliant engineers or product designers but have never managed complex organizations. Doerr could diagnose problems that others might miss. If a company was missing quarterly targets, other VCs might think the market was softer than expected or the product needed more features. Doerr would ask operational questions. What is your process for setting sales quotas? How do you track pipeline? What conversion metrics do you measure? Often, the problem was not market conditions or product quality. It was operational execution, poor forecasting, inadequate measurement, unclear accountability. Second, Doerr could provide specific, actionable guidance based on proven methodologies. The most famous example is OKRs, which he taught to Google, Intuit, and numerous other portfolio companies. But OKRs were just one tool in a larger toolkit. Doerr could help companies design performance review systems, hiring processes, sales methodologies, board meeting structures, all the organizational scaffolding that transforms a startup into a scalable company. This operational value add made founders want to work with Doerr even when other VCs offered similar terms or better valuations. Money is a commodity in venture capital. All VCs have capital to deploy. The differentiation comes from what else you bring. Doerr brought the accumulated wisdom of Intel's operational excellence, distilled into frameworks that young companies could actually use. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Doerr understood the relationship between company culture and operational performance. At Intel, he had seen how Grove's demand for excellence created a culture where mediocrity was unacceptable. That culture became self-reinforcing. Great people wanted to work at Intel because they would be surrounded by other great people. New hires quickly learned the standards and either rose to meet them or left. Doerr recognized that missionary companies needed missionary cultures. It was not enough to have missionary founders. You needed to hire people who shared the mission, who cared about the work beyond their paycheck. This was particularly important during the scaling phase, when companies hire hundreds of people quickly. If you are not careful, dilution happens, not equity dilution but mission dilution. The original intensity gets lost as the company grows. Doerr advised founders on how to maintain culture during growth, hire slowly and fire quickly. Do not compromise on quality to fill seats. Articulate your values explicitly and reinforce them constantly. Celebrate people who exemplify the culture. Remove people who violate it, even if they are producing results. Culture is not about free food and ping-pong tables. It is about shared purpose and standards of excellence. This focus on culture and operational excellence distinguished Doerr from most venture capitalists. He was not just a capital allocator or strategy consultant. He was an organizational architect, helping founders build companies that could actually deliver on their ambitious visions. When John Doerr joined Kleiner Perkins in 1980, he entered one of the most powerful networks in technology. Kleiner Perkins, founded in 1972 by Eugene Kleiner and Tom Perkins, had already established itself as Silicon Valley's premier venture capital firm. The firm had backed Genentech, which pioneered biotechnology. It had funded Tandem Computers, which created the first fault-tolerant computer systems. It was developing a reputation for identifying breakthrough technologies before anyone else. But the firm's real asset was not its capital. It was its network. The Kleiner Perkins partners knew everyone, the best entrepreneurs, the top technologists, the leading academics, the influential executives. When Eugene Kleiner walked into a conference, people paid attention because he had been one of the traitorous 8 who founded Fairchild Semiconductor. When Tom Perkins called, people took the meeting because he had credibility from building Hewlett-Packard's computer division. Doerr leveraged this network brilliantly, but he also expanded it in ways that created unique advantages. 3 specific network strategies defined his approach. First, Doerr cultivated relationships with academic researchers at Stanford, MIT, Berkeley, and other top universities. These were not casual relationships. He visited labs, attended research presentations, read papers, and built genuine friendships with professors and graduate students. This gave him early visibility into technological breakthroughs before they were commercialized. When Larry Page and Sergey Brin were PhD students working on PageRank, Doerr already knew people in Stanford's computer science department. When Mark Andreessen was at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications creating the Mosaic browser, Doerr heard about it through his network before most VCs knew it existed. This early visibility created enormous advantages. By the time a technology became broadly known, Doerr had already assessed it, built relationships with the key people, and positioned himself to invest if the team commercialized. Second, Doerr built a reputation as someone who added genuine value beyond capital. This reputation became self-reinforcing. Entrepreneurs who had worked with Doerr told other entrepreneurs about his operational guidance, his network, his OKR methodology. This created a flow of inbound opportunities. The best founders wanted to work with Kleiner Perkins specifically because they wanted Doerr on their board. This deal flow advantage is crucial in venture capital. Most VCs see random opportunities brought by intermediaries or entrepreneurs they do not know. The best VCs see proprietary deal flow opportunities they hear about first, often directly from founders who seek them out. Doerr's reputation created proprietary deal flow. When someone in the Stanford computer science department had a breakthrough idea, they would often call Doerr first. Third, Doerr actively connected his portfolio companies with each other, creating what we would now call a platform strategy. If one of his companies needed to hire a great CFO, Doerr would make introductions to CFOs at other portfolio companies or executives in his network. If a company needed a technology partnership, Doerr would facilitate connections. This platform value increased loyalty and created network effects. The more companies Doerr backed, the more valuable his network became, which attracted more great founders. One specific example illustrates how Doerr's network created competitive advantage. In 1994, when Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen were starting Netscape, they needed venture capital. They could have gone to any top firm in Silicon Valley. They chose Kleiner Perkins, and specifically wanted Doerr on the board, because Doerr's network could help them navigate the immense challenges of building a browser company that was taking on Microsoft. Doerr helped Netscape recruit James Barksdale, a legendary executive from AT&T and McCaw Cellular, to be CEO. This was a crucial hire. Clark and Andreessen were brilliant technologists and visionaries, but neither had experience running a rapidly scaling company. Barksdale provided adult supervision, operational excellence, and credibility with enterprise customers. That hire, facilitated by Doerr's network, was arguably as valuable as the venture capital investment itself. Similarly, when Google needed to hire a CEO to provide structure to Larry and Sergey's creative chaos, Doerr led the search that eventually landed Eric Schmidt. Schmidt, who had been CTO at Sun Microsystems and CEO at Novell, brought exactly the operational expertise and adult supervision Google needed. Larry and Sergey initially resisted the idea of an outside CEO, but Doerr convinced them that they needed someone who could translate their vision into organizational reality. That hire enabled Google's successful scaling from a promising startup to a dominant global platform. Doerr's network advantage was not accidental or luck. It was deliberately cultivated over decades through genuine relationship building, consistent value delivery, and strategic positioning at the intersections of academia, entrepreneurship, and established technology companies. When John Doerr joined Kleiner Perkins in 1980, the personal computer industry was nascent, misunderstood, and about to explode. The Apple II, introduced in 1977, had demonstrated that computers could be consumer products, not just tools for businesses and hobbyists. But most people still did not own computers. Most companies did not see why they would need them. The dominant computing paradigm was still centralized, mainframes and mini-computers owned by institutions, accessed through terminals. The economic context was turbulent. The United States was experiencing stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation, and stagnant growth. Interest rates, controlled by Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, would peak above 20% in 1981 as Volcker tried to crush inflation. The prime rate hit 21.5%. Borrowing money was extraordinarily expensive. Many businesses struggled. Venture capital, which depends on companies eventually accessing public markets or acquisition buyers, faced challenging conditions. Yet technological progress was accelerating. Intel's microprocessors were getting faster and cheaper, following Moore's law, which predicted that chip performance would double every 18 to 24 months while costs fell. This created a powerful economic dynamic. Every year, you could build a computer that was twice as powerful for the same price, or equally powerful for half the price. This meant computers would eventually become affordable for everyone, though most people could not yet see it. The software industry was even more primitive. Bill Gates and Paul Allen had founded Microsoft in 1975, but it was still a tiny company focused on programming languages. VCCALC, the first spreadsheet program, had been released in 1979 and was selling well on the Apple II, proving that software could drive hardware sales. But the idea of a software company being more valuable than a hardware company seemed absurd. Hardware was tangible, manufacturable, defensible through patents. Software was ephemeral, easily copied, seemingly impossible to protect. Into this environment, Doerr brought his Intel experience and operational knowledge. He understood microprocessors deeply, their economics, their performance trajectories, their applications. He had watched the transition from mainframes to mini-computers to microprocessors. He knew that each transition had created new market leaders while disrupting incumbents. And he believed the personal computer transition was still in its early innings, with enormous opportunities ahead. The investment that made Doerr's reputation in his first decade at Kleiner Perkins was Compaq Computer. Compaq was founded in 1982 by Rod Canion, Jim Harris, and Bill Murto, three former Texas Instruments engineers who had a simple but audacious idea: build a portable computer that was fully compatible with the IBM PC. IBM had released its personal computer in August 1981, and it was quickly becoming the business standard. But IBM's PC was a desktop machine, heavy, requiring a dedicated desk and power outlet. The Compaq founders believed there was a market for a computer that business people could carry to meetings or on airplanes. They sketched the first design on a placemat at a Houston pie shop, a luggable computer with a built-in screen and keyboard. The technical challenge was achieving full IBM compatibility. IBM had made some strategic decisions, using Intel's 8088 microprocessor and Microsoft's DOS operating system, both available to outside companies, that created an opening for clones. But compatibility was tricky. Compaq needed to reverse engineer IBM's BIOS, the basic input-output system that controlled how the hardware and software communicated, without violating IBM's copyrights. They did this through a clever clean room approach. One team studied the IBM BIOS and wrote detailed specifications describing what it did, then a completely separate team implemented those specifications from scratch, ensuring they did not copy any actual IBM code. Doerr recognized several key advantages. First, the IBM PC had established a standard that created a huge addressable market. Anyone building IBM-compatible products could access that market without having to create an entire ecosystem from scratch. Second, portability was a genuinely compelling feature for business customers. Third, the founders were experienced engineers who understood the technical challenges and had a clear execution plan. Kleiner Perkins led Compaq's Series A round with $1.5 million in early 1982. The company shipped its first product, the Compaq Portable, in March 1983. It was the size of a sewing machine, weighed 28 pounds, and cost $3,590, expensive but less than an IBM PC with comparable specs. The market responded enthusiastically. Compaq generated $111 million in revenue in its first year, the fastest any company had reached $100 million at that time. In 1983, the company went public in what was then the largest technology IPO since Apple. Kleiner Perkins's stake, acquired for a few $1 million, was suddenly worth tens of millions. More importantly, Doerr had demonstrated his ability to identify breakthrough companies in the PC hardware market. Compaq would go on to become one of the largest PC manufacturers in the world, eventually acquiring Digital Equipment Corporation and, in 2002, merging with Hewlett-Packard. But But Compaq's story also illustrates the limitations of hardware businesses, a lesson Doerr would absorb and apply throughout his career. Hardware companies face constant competitive pressure. Manufacturing costs can be undercut by competitors. Distribution advantages erode. Technology leadership is temporary. Compaq dominated in the 1980s and 1990s but was eventually commoditized as PCs became undifferentiated products competing primarily on price. This experience helped shape Doerr's later emphasis on platform companies and software businesses, which have better economics and more durable advantages than pure hardware plays. Another defining investment of this era was Sun Microsystems, founded in 1982 by Andreas Bechtolsheim, Vinod Khosla, and Scott McNealy, Stanford students who wanted to build powerful workstations for engineers and researchers. The company's name stood for Stanford University Network. Sun's insight was that workstations, high-performance computers designed for technical users, could be built using standard components rather than proprietary systems. They used Motorola's 68,000 microprocessor, ran Unix operating system, and networked multiple machines together. This created a more open, affordable alternative to the proprietary workstation sold by companies like Apollo Computer. Doerr saw several advantages in Sunday. First, the technical team was exceptional. Bechtolsheim was a brilliant hardware designer. Khosla and McNealy were aggressive, ambitious operators. Bill Joy, who joined as a co-founder, had co-developed BSD Unix at Berkeley and was one of the most respected software engineers in the world. Second, the Unix workstation market was growing rapidly as engineering teams needed more computing power for CAD, CAM, simulation, and software development. Third, Sun's open systems approach was counter to the industry trend toward proprietary lock-in, and Doerr believed openness would win. Sun went public in 1986 and grew rapidly throughout the late 1980s and 1990s. The company would eventually reach a market capitalization above $200 billion during the dot-com boom, though it would later decline and be acquired by Oracle in 2010. For Kleiner Perkins, the Sun investment generated enormous returns and also created valuable relationships. Doerr would later serve on Sun's board, giving him insights into enterprise computing and networking that would inform future investments. Through these early investments, Doerr's philosophy crystallized around several core beliefs. First, he learned to focus on exceptional founding teams. Compaq succeeded partly because Rod Canion and his co-founders were experienced engineers who knew how to execute. Sun succeeded partly because Khosla, McNealy, and Joy were brilliant and complementary. Technical capability mattered, but so did operational excellence and the ability to attract great people. Second, Doerr became convinced that timing was crucial. Technology markets have windows of opportunity that open and close. The IBM PC clone market existed because IBM had made specific architectural choices and because the market was growing rapidly. That window eventually closed as PCs commoditized. The Unix workstation market existed because mini-computers were too expensive and PCs too weak for technical computing. That window eventually closed as PCs became powerful enough for most engineering tasks. Third, Doerr learned that Missionary founders outperformed Mercenary founders. The entrepreneurs who succeeded were not just smart business people maximizing profits. They were obsessed with their products, their customers, and their vision. Rod Canion cared deeply about building the best portable computer. Scott McNealy believed passionately in open systems. That intensity translated into better products, better teams, and ultimately better outcomes. By the early 1990s, the personal computer revolution was mature. PCs were mainstream. Microsoft dominated operating systems and office productivity software. Intel dominated microprocessors. But the next wave was just beginning, and most people could not see it yet. The Internet had existed since the 1960s, originally as ARPANET, a government-funded network connecting research institutions. By 1990, it had expanded to universities, government agencies, and a small number of tech companies. But it was text-only, command-line driven, difficult to use, and had little commercial content. Tim Berners-Lee had invented the World Wide Web in 1989, creating a system of hyperlinked documents, but it remained obscure, used mainly by academics. The breakthrough came in 1993 when Mark Andreessen and a team at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, NCSA, at the University of Illinois released Mosaic, the first graphical web browser. Mosaic made the web visual and intuitive. You could click on links instead of typing commands. You could see images embedded in pages. Suddenly, the internet was accessible to normal people, not just technical experts. The economic context was much better than in 1980. The United States was recovering from the early 1990s recession. Interest rates were falling. The stock market was climbing. The Cold War had ended with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, creating a sense that America had won and a new era of peace and prosperity was dawning. Capital was flowing into riskier assets, including venture capital funds. But most people still did not see the internet's potential. In 1993, there were only about 130 websites in the entire world. Most businesses did not have websites. Most consumers did not have internet access at home. The idea that the internet would transform commerce, media, communication, and daily life seemed like science fiction to most observers. John Doerr, however, saw something different. His Intel training had taught him to recognize inflection points, moments when a technology transitions from niche to mainstream. The graphical browser was that inflection point for the internet. Just as the graphical user interface had made personal computers accessible to non-technical users in the 1980s, Mosaic was making the internet accessible in the 1990s. The implications were staggering. In early 1994, Mark Andreessen left NCSA and met Jim Clark, the founder of Silicon Graphics and a legendary entrepreneur. Clark was restless, looking for his next big thing. Andreessen was 22 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and convinced that the browser could be the foundation for a new kind of software company. Together, they decided to start Netscape Communications Corporation to build a commercial version of Mosaic, better, faster, more powerful. They needed venture capital. Clark had his own money and could have self-funded, but he wanted Silicon Valley's top VCs involved for their networks and credibility. They approached multiple firms, but John Doerr and Kleiner Perkins won the deal. Doerr understood what they were building in a way that other VCs did not. Most VCs saw a browser as a nice utility but could not understand the business model. How do you make money giving away free software? The internet had no advertising yet. E-commerce did not exist. There was no obvious revenue model. But Doerr saw beyond the immediate business model to the platform opportunity. If Netscape's browser became the primary interface for the internet, if it became as ubiquitous as Windows was for PCs, then Netscape could monetize in multiple ways, selling server software to enterprises, licensing the browser to PC makers, offering premium features, or even challenging Microsoft's desktop dominance. Kleiner Perkins invested $5 million in Netscape in mid-1994. Doerr joined the board and immediately went to work helping the company. He connected Andreessen and Clark with potential executives, including James Barksdale, who became CEO. Barksdale, a veteran of AT&T and McCaw Cellular, brought operational discipline and enterprise sales expertise that Netscape desperately needed. This hire was transformative. Andreessen could focus on product and technology. Clark could focus on vision and strategy. Barksdale could run the business. Netscape Navigator launched in December 1994 and was an immediate hit. It was faster than Mosaic, more stable, and had features that made browsing easier and more enjoyable. Within months, Netscape dominated the browser market with over 80% market share. The company's revenue grew from zero to tens of millions almost overnight as enterprises bought Netscape's server software. But the real breakthrough came in August 1995 when Netscape went public. The IPO was one of the most spectacular in history. The stock was initially priced at $14 per share, then raised to $28 just before launch. On the first day of trading, it opened at $71 and closed at $58.25, giving Netscape a market capitalization of $2.9 billion. The company was less than 2 years old and had only $16.6 million in revenue for the first half of 1995. The Netscape IPO changed everything. It proved that internet companies could create enormous value. It triggered a wave of entrepreneurship as engineers and business people saw that internet companies could make them rich. It established the template for the dot-com boom that would dominate the rest of the decade. And it made John Doerr one of the most famous and influential venture capitalists in the world. Kleiner Perkins's stake, acquired for $5 million, was suddenly worth hundreds of millions. But the financial return, while spectacular, was almost secondary to the strategic importance. Netscape validated Doerr's thesis that the internet would be transformative. It established Kleiner Perkins as the leading internet investor. And it positioned Doerr to see and fund the next wave of internet companies. Netscape's success drew a lethal competitor, Microsoft. Bill Gates initially dismissed the internet, but by late 1995, he recognized his mistake. In a famous memo titled The Internet Tidal Wave, Gates declared the internet Microsoft's top priority and announced that Microsoft would bundle a free browser, Internet Explorer, with Windows. This triggered the browser wars, one of the defining business battles of the 1990s. Microsoft had enormous advantages. Windows was on over 90% of PCs, Microsoft could afford to give away Internet Explorer for free, and the company had virtually unlimited resources. Netscape, despite its early lead, was a startup with limited capital and no operating system to bundle with. Doerr watched this battle unfold from Netscape's board. He saw how Microsoft used its operating system monopoly to crush competitors, tactics that would eventually lead to antitrust investigations and lawsuits. He saw how even great products and great execution could be overcome by structural advantages and ruthless competition. And he saw how quickly dominance could erode in technology markets. By 1998, Internet Explorer had recaptured browser market share from Netscape. In November 1998, AOL acquired Netscape for $4.2 billion in stock, far below its peak valuation but still a successful exit. For Kleiner Perkins, the investment generated returns of over 100x in 4 years. For Doerr personally, it cemented his reputation as the venture capitalist who understood the internet better than anyone else. In 1995, while Netscape was going public, John Doerr heard about a former Wall Street executive named Jeff Bezos who had quit his job to start an online bookstore. Most people thought this was insane. Why would anyone buy books online when they could go to Barnes & Noble or Borders, browse physically, and take books home immediately? The internet was slow. E-commerce infrastructure barely existed. Shipping costs would kill the economics. And besides, how could an online-only startup compete with massive retail chains? Doerr saw what others missed. Books were a perfect first product for e-commerce, standardized, valuable enough to justify shipping costs, easy to describe online, and impossible to offer infinite selection in physical stores. But more importantly, Doerr recognized that Bezos was thinking bigger than just books. Amazon was building distribution infrastructure and customer relationships that could extend to every category of goods. Books were the wedge, not the vision. Bezos was also clearly a missionary founder. He was not starting Amazon to get rich quick. He was obsessed with customers, with building something that would change retail, with using technology to create value in ways that were previously impossible. He had quit a lucrative job on Wall Street to move across the country and start a company in his garage. That was not the behavior of a mercenary entrepreneur. Kleiner Perkins invested $8 million in Amazon in 1995 at a valuation of around $60 million. Doerr joined the board and immediately started helping Bezos build the company. He helped recruit executives. He provided guidance on going public. He connected Bezos with other entrepreneurs in the Kleiner portfolio who could share lessons about scaling rapidly. Amazon went public in May 1997 at $18 per share, raising $54 million. The stock more than doubled on the first day. Over the next few years, Amazon would grow explosively, expanding from books into music, videos, electronics, and eventually nearly every product category imaginable. The company would face numerous near-death experiences, running out of cash in the early 2000s, being dismissed as the Amazon bomb when the internet bubble burst, but Bezos's relentless focus on customers and long-term thinking would eventually vindicate the vision. Kleiner Perkins's investment of $8 million would eventually be worth billions. More importantly, Amazon became proof of Doerr's thesis that the internet would transform commerce. Netscape had proven the internet could change software. Amazon proved it could change retail. Together, these investments established that the internet was not a fad but a fundamental platform shift comparable to the personal computer revolution. By 1998, the internet investment landscape had changed dramatically. What had been a niche opportunity in 1994 was now the hottest investment theme in the world. Every venture capitalist wanted to fund internet companies. Every entrepreneur wanted to start one. Investment bankers were taking companies public months after they were founded. Valuations were soaring to levels that had no relationship to revenues, profits, or any traditional financial metrics. The logic of the bubble was seductive. The internet was clearly transformative. It would change every industry. Therefore, internet companies would be enormously valuable. Therefore, paying high valuations today made sense because these companies would be worth far more tomorrow. Get in early, get big fast, worry about profits later. This logic was not entirely wrong. The internet did transform nearly every industry. Many internet companies did become enormously valuable. But the bubble mentality led to massive capital misallocation. Hundreds of billions of dollars flowed into companies with no viable business models, no competitive advantages, and no path to profitability. Money was raised based on eyeballs and page views rather than revenue or profit. Companies spent millions on Super Bowl ads before they had figured out their product market fit. John Doerr was not immune to the bubble. Kleiner Perkins funded numerous companies during this period that would later fail spectacularly. But Doerr also maintained discipline in key areas. He continued to focus on missionary founders and breakthrough technologies. He continued to emphasize operational excellence and OKRs. And in 1999, he made the investment that would define his career, Google. By late 1999, when Doerr invested in Google, the consensus view was that search was sold and saturated. Yahoo was the dominant portal, worth tens of billions. Several other search engines existed: AltaVista, Lycos, Excite, InfoGeek. Most investors believed the real opportunity was in aggregating content and services into portals, not in pure search. Moreover, Google had no business model. Page and Sergey had deliberately avoided cluttering their clean interface with banner ads or sponsored links. They believed that advertising corrupted search results and that they should focus on building the best product first and figure out monetization later. This was admirable from a user experience perspective but alarming from an investment perspective. But Doerr saw several things that others missed. First, Google's search results were dramatically better than alternatives. PageRank, which ranked websites based on how many other sites linked to them, was a genuine breakthrough that produced more relevant results. Doerr could test this himself. Searching on Google versus searching on AltaVista or Yahoo yielded noticeably different quality. Second, Larry and Sergey were quintessential missionary founders. They were not trying to build a nice business. They were trying to organize all the world's information. That ambition was simultaneously audacious and compelling. Third, Doerr recognized that the best products in huge markets eventually find business models. Google could not monetize search yet, but if they dominated search, opportunities would emerge. This was exactly the logic that had worked for Netscape: build the dominant product first, figure out monetization second. Fourth, Doerr understood that platform businesses with network effects could grow far larger than anyone initially imagined. If Google became the standard for search, as Windows had for operating systems or Intel had for microprocessors, the potential value was enormous. Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia Capital jointly invested $12.5 million in Google in June 1999 for about 12% of the company, valuing it at roughly $100 million. Doerr and Sequoia's Michael Moritz both joined the board. And within weeks, Doerr brought Google the OKR system that would help them scale from 35 employees to tens of thousands without losing focus. In March 2000, the Nasdaq Composite Index peaked at 5,048, up 400% from 1995. Then the bubble burst. Over the next 2 years, the Nasdaq would lose 78% of its value, falling to 1,114 in October 2002. Hundreds of internet companies went bankrupt. Thousands of people lost their jobs. Billions of dollars of venture capital investments were written off as worthless. The proximate cause was a recognition that most internet companies had no viable business models. They were burning cash at unsustainable rates. They would never be profitable. When the public market stopped providing capital through IPOs and secondary offerings, these companies collapsed. The motto "Get big fast" turned out to be a recipe for disaster when big meant big losses rather than big profits. For John Doerr and Kleiner Perkins, the crash was painful. Many of their late 1990s investments failed completely. The firm's returns from its 1999 and 2000 funds would be mediocre at best. Some critics suggested that Doerr had lost his touch, that he had been caught up in bubble mania like everyone else. But beneath the wreckage, Doerr's best investments were not only surviving but thriving. Amazon, which had dropped from $106 per share in 1999 to $6 per share in 2001, was still alive. Many analysts predicted bankruptcy, but Bezos had raised enough capital during the bubble to survive the crash. The company focused on operational efficiency, eventually achieving profitability, and would emerge from the crash stronger than before. Google, still private during the crash, was also thriving. In 2000, the company had finally figured out monetization through AdWords, a system that let advertisers bid for placement based on search keywords. This business model was revolutionary. Unlike banner ads, which were intrusive and ineffective, AdWords were relevant to what users were searching for. Advertisers only paid when users clicked. This created a virtuous cycle: better ads, happier users, more searches, more advertising revenue. By 2002, Google was generating hundreds of millions in revenue and was profitable. The company would go public in August 2004 at $85 per share, valuing it at $23 billion. Within a few years, Google would be worth hundreds of billions, and Kleiner Perkins's investment would generate returns of over 300x, one of the most successful venture capital investments in history. The crash taught Doerr important lessons that would shape his investing in the following decades. First, business models matter. You cannot ignore fundamental economics forever. Eventually, companies need to generate more cash than they burn. Second, missionary founders with real technological advantages survive crashes that kill mercenary founders chasing hype. Bezos and Page and Sergey persevered through the crash because they believed in their missions, not because they were trying to flip companies quickly. Third, the best time to invest is often when everyone else is fearful. The companies Doerr backed in the early 2000s, after the crash, would generate excellent returns because valuations were rational and only serious entrepreneurs were still starting companies. By 2004, the internet boom and bust cycle was complete. The survivors had proven their business models. Amazon was profitable and growing. Google was about to go public. eBay had become the dominant online marketplace. The internet was no longer a speculative bet, it was infrastructure, as fundamental to business as electricity or telecommunications. But even as the internet matured, new platforms were emerging that would create the next wave of innovation. Mobile phones were becoming smarter and more capable. Social networks were enabling new forms of communication and community. And a new generation of entrepreneurs was thinking about applying technology to problems beyond the digital realm: energy, transportation, healthcare, education. John Doerr, now in his early 50s, was at the peak of his influence and wealth. The Google IPO in 2004 had generated billions in returns for Kleiner Perkins and had made Doerr personally extremely wealthy. He could have retired, content with his legacy. Instead, he leaned in, looking for the next transformative opportunities. In the mid-2000s, Doerr became increasingly concerned about climate change. He saw it as the most important challenge facing humanity, an existential threat that required urgent action. And he believed that venture capital and entrepreneurship could be part of the solution. If technology and capitalism had created the problem through fossil fuel dependence, perhaps they could also solve it through clean energy innovation. This led Doerr and Kleiner Perkins to invest heavily in clean tech, renewable energy, electric vehicles, battery technology, biofuels, and other technologies aimed at reducing carbon emissions. Between 2006 and 2011, Kleiner Perkins invested over $1 billion in clean tech companies, far more than any other venture firm. The thesis was compelling. Energy was a multi-trillion-dollar market. Fossil fuels were causing climate change and would eventually become scarce. Clean alternatives would become cost-competitive as technology improved and scale increased. Early investors in successful clean tech companies could generate both enormous returns and positive social impact. Doerr invested in companies like Bloom Energy, Fuel Cells, Fisker Automotive, electric sports cars, Myosol, thin-film solar panels, and numerous others. He recruited high-profile partners like Al Gore, the former vice president who had become a climate activist after his 2000 presidential campaign. He gave impassioned speeches about climate change and the opportunity for green capitalism. But clean tech proved far more difficult than internet software. Manufacturing physical products required enormous capital. Energy markets were heavily regulated and politically influenced. Established energy companies had massive advantages in distribution and infrastructure. Technology improvements were incremental rather than exponential. And the 2008 financial crisis destroyed capital availability just when these companies needed funding to scale. Most of Kleiner Perkins's clean tech investments failed. Fisker went bankrupt. Myosol was sold at a fraction of its investment. Bloom Energy survived but never achieved the transformative success Doerr had hoped for. By 2012, Kleiner Perkins had largely retreated from clean tech, having lost hundreds of millions of dollars. For Doerr personally, the clean tech failure was deeply disappointing. He had believed that his pattern recognition and operational knowledge from internet investing would translate to energy. But the sectors were fundamentally different. Internet software benefits from network effects, zero marginal costs, and rapid iteration cycles. Energy is capital-intensive, subject to physical constraints, and changes slowly. The Missionary founder framework that worked brilliantly for software companies did not work as well for hardware and energy companies facing entirely different challenges. Critics pointed to clean tech as evidence that Doerr and Kleiner Perkins had lost their edge. But defenders noted that Doerr had tried to solve an important problem and had been willing to fail in pursuit of impact. Not every investment can succeed. The question was whether he could recover and find the next wave of opportunity. While clean tech was disappointing, Doerr had better success with social media. In 2009, Kleiner Perkins invested in Twitter, the microblogging platform that had become a cultural phenomenon. Twitter had been founded in 2006 and had grown rapidly, reaching hundreds of millions of users by 2009. The platform was influential beyond its size. Politicians, journalists, celebrities, and activists used Twitter to communicate directly with audiences. Doerr saw Twitter as a platform for real-time information sharing that could be as important as search or email. The company had passionate, engaged users. It was becoming essential infrastructure for public discourse. The challenge was monetization. Twitter had struggled to generate significant revenue despite its cultural impact. Kleiner Perkins's Twitter investment would eventually generate returns when the company went public in 2013, though not the massive multiples of Google or Amazon. Twitter remained a culturally important but financially challenged company, demonstrating that user engagement and cultural relevance do not always translate to business success. By 2015, the technology landscape had changed dramatically from when Doerr started in venture capital. The internet was mature. Mobile had become the dominant computing platform. Social media had transformed communication. Cloud computing had changed how software was built and deployed. And a new generation of entrepreneurs was building companies in ways that Doerr had helped pioneer, but that now seemed standard practice. Doerr was in his mid-60s. He had been a venture capitalist for 35 years. He had generated extraordinary returns and had helped build some of the most important technology companies in history. But the clean tech failures had been humbling. The question was what came next. While Doerr's investment returns are extraordinary, his most enduring contribution to business may be popularizing OKRs, objectives, and key results. What he learned from Andy Grove in 1975 and taught to Google in 1999, Doerr has now evangelized to thousands of companies through his book Measure What Matters, published in 2017. The book became a bestseller, introducing OKRs to a mainstream business audience far beyond Silicon Valley. Companies from Fortune 500 corporations to small startups adopted the methodology. OKRs became standard practice in technology companies and spread to other industries. This systematic approach to goal setting and measurement, which Doerr learned at Intel and refined through decades of helping companies scale, may ultimately impact more organizations and people than any individual investment. The OKR framework's power lies in its simplicity. Every quarter, teams and individuals set objectives, significant, concrete, action-oriented goals. For each objective, they define key results, measurable outcomes that indicate whether the objective was achieved. At quarter's end, they score their key results, typically on a 0.0 to 1.0 scale, and learn from what worked and what did not. This creates alignment, accountability, and continuous improvement. What makes Doerr's contribution significant is not inventing OKRs, Andy Grove did that. It is recognizing their power, proving they work at multiple companies, and systematically teaching them to the next generation of leaders. Doerr served as the transmission mechanism that brought Grove's management innovation from Intel to Google to the world. John Doerr remains active but has transitioned from leading venture investments to focusing on philanthropy, climate advocacy, and mentoring the next generation. He continues to serve on boards and advise companies, but his day-to-day involvement in deal-making has decreased. His net worth, estimated at nearly $15 billion, makes him one of the wealthiest venture capitalists in history. But consistent with his missionary orientation, he has committed to giving away the vast majority of his wealth. He and his wife and Doerr have pledged over $1.2 billion to various causes, including climate change initiatives, education, and healthcare. The Doerr's largest single gift was $1.1 billion to Stanford University in 2022 to create the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, the first new school at Stanford in 70 years. This reflects Doerr's continuing commitment to addressing climate change, even after the clean tech investment failures. The school focuses on research, education, and policy solutions for environmental challenges. Doerr's investment philosophy continues to influence how venture capital operates. The emphasis on missionary founders, the focus on platform businesses with network effects, the importance of operational value add beyond capital. These principles are now standard practice among top venture firms. Many of today's leading venture capitalists cite Doerr as an influence and role model. John Doerr's journey from St. Louis middle-class family to Rice electrical engineering student to Intel salesman to legendary venture capitalist is more than a business success story. It is a case study in how pattern recognition, operational excellence, and missionary commitment can create extraordinary value in an age of technological transformation. What made Doerr exceptional was not any single insight or investment. It was the system he built over 50 years, a framework for identifying breakthrough founders before others saw their potential, a methodology for helping companies scale without losing focus, a network that created information advantages and deal flow, and a value system that oriented him toward impact and mission rather than just money. The Google investment, $12 million that returned over $5 billion, was not luck. It was the culmination of 20 years learning to recognize missionary founders, understanding that the best products find business models, knowing how to provide operational value through OKRs, and being willing to bet against consensus. That investment exemplifies everything Doerr learned and everything he taught. But Doerr's story also reveals the limits of individual genius and venture capital. The clean tech failures showed that pattern recognition from one domain does not automatically transfer to others. The gender discrimination lawsuit at Kleiner Perkins highlighted cultural issues that even successful firms struggle with. The concentration of wealth in Doerr's hands raises questions about whether value created by technology companies is shared equitably. What will endure from Doerr's career is not just the financial returns, though those are extraordinary. It is the operational frameworks, particularly OKRs, that thousands of companies now use. It is the emphasis on missionary founders that has become venture capital orthodoxy. It is the demonstration that venture capitalists can provide value beyond capital through operational guidance and network effects. And it is the pivot to philanthropy and climate advocacy, showing that wealth generated from technology investing can be redirected towards society's most pressing challenges. In September 1999, when John Doerr invested in Google, he made a bet that 2 graduate students with no business model could organize the world's information and build a $100 billion company. That bet succeeded beyond even Doerr's optimistic projections. Google is now worth over $2 trillion. It has become essential infrastructure for billions of people. It has created enormous wealth for founders, employees, and investors. But the deeper story is how Doerr knew to make that bet when others did not. The answer lies in 50 years of preparation, 6 years at Intel learning from Andy Grove, 45 years recognizing patterns across hundreds of companies, decades building relationships and networks, and a lifetime oriented toward mission rather than just money. John Doerr did not just get lucky repeatedly. He built a system for generating luck, for being in position to see breakthrough opportunities before others, for being the investor that Missionary founders wanted to work with, for providing operational value that helped companies succeed, and for persevering through failures like clean tech to keep pursuing impact. His story is ultimately about how individual agency, pattern recognition, and systematic thinking can create extraordinary outcomes in an age of technological transformation. It is about how the lessons learned from Andy Grove at Intel could scale to help build Google, Amazon, and dozens of other transformative companies. And it is about how wealth and success, when oriented toward mission and impact, can be redirected toward humanity's biggest challenges. Andy Grove told John Doerr in 1980 that venture capital was not a real job. 45 years later, the verdict is clear. Doerr proved that venture capital, done right, is one of the most impactful jobs imaginable. Not because it makes people rich, though it does, but because it identifies and empowers the missionary founders who build the technologies that transform how humanity lives, works, communicates, and solves problems. That is John Doerr's legacy, not just billions in returns, but a framework for recognizing and nurturing the missionaries who change the world.